The leaked Beecroft Report has been stirring up controversy all week. It's a series of proposals for reforming employment law with the aim of boosting growth, written by a venture capitalist, Adrian Beecroft. And there's been quite a fuss. Here's a tape of some men shouting at each other.
The business secretary says it is the last thing government should do. Who does the Prime Minister agree with?
But we need to make it easier for businesses to grow, for businesses to take people on, for businesses to expand.
The report was criticised by the Business Secretary Vince Cable, who didn't like the proposal to allow employers to fire their employees at will. Mr Beecroft, in turn, accused Mr Cable of being a socialist. I should declare an interest here. I briefly worked for Vince Cable a long time ago when he was preaching his socialism as the chief economist of a major multinational oil company. Enjoyable as this personality politics is, what really interests us is the data. The logic is pretty clear on both sides here. If employers are able to sack workers at will, they might do just that. On the other hand, if employers are able to sack workers at will, they might be much happier to hire them and give them a chance. But beyond laying out the theoretical argument, what's the evidence that employers should be able to fire their staff at will? And come to think of it, what's the evidence that they shouldn't? Well, I've got the Beecroft Report here. At least I thought I had it, but my lazy producer seems to have only printed the executive summary. Rich, could you bring the whole Beecroft Report in here, please?
Tim, I've checked, and that is actually the whole report.
Don't be ridiculous, Rich. It's only 15 pages long. There are no footnotes, there are no citations, there's no evidence. This isn't really a review.
Yeah, well, OK then. Why don't you call it a pamphlet instead?
Well, the Beecroft pamphlet might be an evidence-free publication, but perhaps there's evidence elsewhere. So we've been looking for it. One of the obvious sources is the OECD, an organisation which does a lot of work measuring and reviewing the economies and economic policies of rich nations. We spoke to Christophe André, acting head of the OECD's UK desk, and asked him whether the UK was being held back by excessive labour regulation.
No, in comparison with OECD countries, employment protection legislation in the UK is fairly light. Only the US has lighter employment protection legislation for regular employment, and for temporary workers, only Canada, the US and the Slovak Republic has lighter regulation.
So the OECD thinks excessive labour regulation could cause a problem, but that the UK itself is a long way from being in that situation. We also called a couple of pro-market think tanks, the Adam Smith Institute and the Institute for Economic Affairs. They welcome Adrian Beecroft's logic, but they aren't aware of any particular evidence which supports it. So I called John Van Reenen, the director of the Centre for Economic Performance at the London School of Economics. If anyone would know what evidence exists in this area, John Van Reenen would.
The conclusion of the vast majority of the studies is that there is actually no significant relationship between employment protection and the overall level of unemployment. For example, one recent study looked at 14 countries over about 15 or 16 years and found there was no significant relationship. In fact, they actually found there seemed to be a positive effect of tougher employment protection on lowering unemployment. So in fact the opposite of Beecroft, but that relationship wasn't statistically significant. In other words, statistically you can't reject the idea that there was actually just a zero effect.
Yeah.
Interestingly, one of the co-authors of that is now currently George Osborne's special advisor.
That is interesting. Presumably that's not the only effect. Loosening employment regulation might boost growth, for instance?
It might do, but equally people have looked at, say, GDP per head, and again found generally no relationship between the toughness of employment protection legislation and growth or the level of GDP per head. So Beecroft seems to be completely wrong.
That's the big macro picture. Have there been any other studies done?
One of the criticisms that you can make of these macroeconomic studies is that there's so many things happening between different countries you can never really control properly for them. So one way to try and dig down into that, if you look at the kind of hundreds of thousands of firms and economies, do they react to employment protection legislation? And there you start to see some effect. So, for example, in Italy, when firms get to be 15 employees large, there's a very big increase of employment protection legislation. And in France, there's something similar when firms get to be 50 or more employees. I have a study which looks at France, which then looks at what firms do in response to that. And of course, just as you would expect, a lot of firms stay at around 48 or 49 employees to avoid paying the extra cost of crossing that threshold of 50 employees. But those effects are pretty small. So when you start adding those all up to see how much that really matters in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't come to a very big effect.
To summarise what I think I'm hearing from you, John, the evidence doesn't really show strong effects, although there are some small reasons to think Beecroft may have a point in certain circumstances. And yet very strong claims have been made on either side of the political aisle. Beecroft himself doesn't refer to any studies in his paper. The politicians don't seem to be terribly interested in evidence. How do you feel as somebody who runs a centre devoted to investigating the evidence on economic performance? How do you feel when this political debate takes place and no one seeds to be terribly interested in the numbers?
Well, it's kind of profoundly depressing, really, because for an issue which is very important, how we can get more growth out of the economy, then it really is important, I think, for politicians on all sides to try and look as best we can at the evidence, and especially with an issue like this, where there is substantial evidence that could be drawn on.
Professor John Van Reenen of the London School of Economics.